Sometimes you think about a place you love, or maybe you hear a song in your head, and just for a second it feels almost real, like you're actually there.
Uh,
Or you try to break some simple habit and it feels genuinely physically hard.
right.
Those little moments, I think they're tiny windows into, well, some pretty fundamental mysteries about how our minds actually work.
Absolutely. They really touch on the big questions, don't they? Like, what is reality to us fundamentally? How do we even form a belief?
Or why we act the way we do. Sometimes it feels like autopilot, other times it takes this huge effort.
Exactly. And that's why we wanted to do this deep dive. We're basically cracking open a classic text that really grapples with these things. How we perceive, how we believe, how we reason, and ultimately how we act.
It's such a rich source, and our goal here really is to pull out the most surprising, the most insightful nuggets, the kind of ideas that stick with you, maybe even change how you think about your own mind a little.
Yeah, think of this as maybe your shortcut to some really profound ideas. We've tailored this deep dive to help you navigate this stuff and hopefully see the fascinating connections it reveals.
Connections you might not expect,
Yeah,
right? Like between just seeing a color and something complex, like willing yourself to do something.
precisely. It connects the dots.
Okay, so let's start at the very beginning then. How the mind builds its world. The text suggests our sense of reality is fundamentally tied to our physical presence. What's the core idea there?
Well, it anchors everything in the body. The sense of our own bodily existence that's presented as the absolute center of our reality.
Our body is ground zero.
Right. And within that, the most direct, the most undeniable inputs are sensations. Feeling hot, seeing red, hearing a sound, that's the bedrock.
So that raw feeling is primary. And the text makes a distinction, doesn't it, between sensation and perception.
It does, and it's a key point. It's not really about two separate things happening in your mind, but more like different functions. Sensation is the raw, isolated input, just the feeling of hot, maybe. Perception is when you start adding context, adding relations to other things.
Oh, yeah.
And the text suggests our earliest thoughts, like an infant's, are almost pure sensation. Just a flood of that's or it without much connection yet. Like it says when an infant first sees light, they sort of are the light rather than seeing it as separate.
Wow. That's a wild thought, being one with the sensory input.
Okay.
So how do we get from these really basic sensations to understanding something as complex as space? How do we know where our body is or where other things are?
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting. The text argues our sense of place, our position, it's fundamentally built up from bodily sensations, things like touch, even pain.
Touch and pain build space.
In a way, yes. Our body isn't just in space. It kind of creates our first sense of space. Feeling a pinprick isn't just pain. It's pain right here at
No.
this specific point on my hand.
So the body itself is the original, like the coordinate system.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. And movement is crucial here, too.
How so?
Well, sensations moving across our skin or across our retina as we move our eyes or head, that helps us differentiate parts of surfaces, build up that spatial map. If you trace a line on your arm with your finger,
Mm-hmm.
that moving sensation defines that path in space relative to your body.
Okay. And the really striking insight here is how relative our knowledge is because of this.
Yes, the text really emphasizes that. Our knowledge isn't necessarily about grasping the object as it is in itself, but more about how it appears and relates to us based on these sensory inputs we get through our body. It's a construction built on our own system.
Right. Let's jump to vision then, because that feels like a place where the mind's constructive work and maybe its potential for error really shows up. You know how looking at a bright color can make a nearby neutral color look kind of tinted?
Ah, visual contrast. Yeah, that's a great example of perception not being just passive recording.
Right.
And the text actually goes into the specific conditions that make this effect strongest, like the colors need to be close together, uniform, sort of medium intensity.
So it's not just random. There are rules to how our system does this. And the text digs into different theories for why it happens, doesn't it?
It does. There was a debate, apparently. Is it purely physiological, something happening right in the nervous system itself? That was Herring's idea, roughly. Or is it more psychological, like an unconscious judgment error we make based on the scene?
And where does the text land?
Well, based on the experiments they had then, it leans towards it being a genuine sensation change caused by those physiological processes, though it definitely acknowledges that judgment errors are real and explain other kinds of illusions.
So the raw feeling itself changes. It's not just how we interpret it later.
Interesting. And speaking of vision not being straightforward, what about things like looking through weird glasses or optical vertigo.
Oh, those are fantastic examples of how the system can get tripped up.
Yeah.
When you look through, say, prismatic glasses, the usual link between how something looks and how far away it feels gets distorted. Your brain kind of struggles to reconcile that.
Your judgment wavers.
Exactly. About size, distance, it all gets shaky. And optical vertigo, that sounds unpleasant.
It can be. That's when you feel like your eyes are moving. Maybe you're trying to track something or your eye muscles are just fatigued, but the image hitting your retina isn't changing the way it should if your eyes were actually scanning a stable scene.
So conflicting signals.
Right. Your brain gets these conflicting signals, and one way it tries to make sense of it is by deciding the object itself must be moving, not your eyes.
Wow. That really hammers home how perception is an interpretation, isn't it? Not just a raw feed. So how is it then that usually, despite images constantly shifting on our retinas as we move our head or walk around, we see things as stable, as, straight or normal-sized?
Yeah, that's a great question. The text offers a really crucial insight here. Experience teaches us to select certain visual sensations as the real ones.
Select them.
Yeah. Specifically, the sensations we get when we're in what feels like a normal position relative to the object looking straight at it from a typical distance, all those other fleeting images from odd angles or weird distances, we learn to treat them as mere signs that point towards that underlying stable reality.
So our brain learns which perspective is the reliable one, the true one.
It figures it out, yeah. We sort of curate our own stable reality based on what's proven reliable through experience.
Which means illusions, then, aren't just random glitches.
Often not, no. They frequently happen when maybe we're not paying enough attention, or when a visual input is genuinely ambiguous. It could be interpreted in more than one way.
Like those optical illusion pictures.
Exactly. And the text even describes how the mind can actively add stuff to the retinal image, sort of completing it based on expectation. That's apparently why something like a concave mask can look convex. Our brain just expects faces to be convex and kind of fills in that expectation, overwriting the raw data.
That's fascinating. And it's a perfect bridge, actually, from perceiving the external world to the internal world of ideas and imagination. How does the mind handle new ideas when they come in? How do they fit?
The text uses this specific term, apperception. It's basically the idea that new incoming sensations or ideas aren't processed in like a vacuum.
Okay.
They get apperceived, which means they're taken up, understood, integrated by existing masses or frameworks of ideas that are already in your mind.
So like if I see a new kind of bird I've never seen before, my existing bird concepts help me recognize it as a bird and maybe classify it.
Exactly that. It gets slotted into your existing mental library.
Mm-hmm.
Now, building on that, there's this really interesting difference between vividly imagining something and actually sensing it. What does the text say is the core distinction?
My gut feeling says it's the intensity, maybe, the feeling of realness.
That's basically the key difference the text highlights,
Right.
primarily one of vividness or intensity. And it uses this incredibly powerful and kind of poignant example, the feeling of a missing amputated limb.
The phantom limb phenomenon.
Right. For someone who's lost a limb, the imagination of that limb can be so intensely vivid, it's almost indistinguishable from a real sensation, especially because there are no actual contradictory sensations coming from the missing part to correct it.
Mm-hmm.
They might even feel they can will that phantom limb to move. It shows how potent imagination can be.
That example really drives it home, yeah. So hallucinations then are basically when that imagined vividness hits the level of a real sensation, but there's nothing external causing it.
Precisely. Hallucinations are described as a strictly sensational form of consciousness. It feels utterly real, like any other sensation. The only difference is the lack of the external object that would normally trigger it. And pseudo-hallucinations are considered maybe milder versions.
And the text gives some pretty striking examples of these unbidden sensations.
Oh,
right?
very vivid ones, yes. Drug-induced visions, seeing phantom figures, that sort of thing. These are sensory experiences just
Wow.
happening without the usual trigger.
Is there an explanation offered for why?
The text explores potential neural reasons. One idea mentioned is that if the normal pathways for associating a sensory idea with other thoughts get blocked somehow, the activity in that specific sensory brain center might ramp up intensely, leading to a kind of sensory explosion.
Like a short circuit.
Sort of.
Mhm.
There's also mention of theories like Benet's suggesting maybe they sometimes start with a subtle physical irritation at a sensory organ, like in the eye or ear, that the brain then elaborates into a full-blown perception.
Interesting. And hypnotism seems related to this, the whole idea of suggestibility.
Yeah, it's brought up as a state where suggestibility is significantly heightened. The text links the hypnotic trance to a kind of monoideism,
Monoideism.
meaning one idea, the suggestion, becomes incredibly dominant and isn't easily corrected by other competing thoughts or external reality checks. It connects this to physiological states, maybe similar to sleep.
And in that state, suggestion can literally change what someone perceives.
Yes, the examples given are pretty compelling. People experiencing suggested changes in their physical state or seeing a detailed portrait on a blank piece of paper just because the hypnotist told them it was there.
Wow.
It dramatically shows how powerful our internal states and suggestions can be in shaping what feels like external reality.
Uh-huh.
Perhaps it makes the person hypersensitive to tiny cues, or maybe it just bypasses the normal reality-checking parts of the brain.
Okay, so moving from these internal experiences, like perception and imagination, towards external action, let's talk about what drives us. How does the text define something as fundamental as instinct?
It's defined quite simply, actually, as an excitomotor impulse that happens because of a pre-existing neural pathway, basically hardwired behavior, a natural response kicked off by a stimulus.
Okay, straightforward enough. And the connection to emotions is really interesting in the text.
It is. Instinctive actions and emotional expressions are presented as being really closely linked, almost shading into one another. And the text puts forward this really powerful and maybe somewhat counterintuitive idea about emotion itself.
Which is?
That the bodily changes are the emotion. We don't tremble because we feel afraid. The idea is we feel afraid because we tremble, because our heart pounds, our stomach drops, our muscles tense up. The feeling is the perception of those bodily states.
So the feeling follows the physical reaction. That's backwards to how I usually think of it.
It feels backwards, yeah. The intellect in this view can sometimes be almost a cold spectator, just observing these primary emotional and instinctive bodily responses happening.
Huh. What strikes me, though, is how complex human instincts seem compared to, say, animals. They don't feel as simple or as fixed.
That's a crucial point the text makes. Human instincts are often transient. Think about intense childhood interests or fears that just fade away.
Yeah.
And maybe more importantly, they can be contradictory. We might have impulses like greed and suspicion directed at the very same thing or person, or curiosity pulling us forward while timidity holds us back.
And the outcome just depends on the moment.
Exactly. Our experience, the immediate situation, maybe our current mood that decides which impulse wins out in that moment. This constant conflict and just the sheer number of different potential impulses we have makes our behavior look much more variable and, well, seemingly intellectual or considered than purely instinctive animals.
So it's not that we lack instincts.
It's almost like we have too many potentially conflicting ones.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's talk about actions we choose to do then, voluntary movements. How does the text explain those, if it's not just instinct?
Right. It makes a strong case that our voluntary actions are based on remembering the sensory effects of past movements.
Sensory effects? Like what?
Like how it felt in your muscles, how it looked, maybe how it sounded when you did that action before. And here's a really key argument the text makes. It says, we don't need some special, mysterious feeling of innervation.
Feeling of?
Innervation, like some internal sensation of the command signal leaving the brain and going to the muscles. The text argues we don't need that to will a movement. The memory of the result is actually the trigger.
So if I want to pick up my coffee cup, it's not about feeling the go signal to my arm muscles. It's more about having the image or the feeling of my hand closing around the cup.
Yes, exactly. That sensory image, whether it's visual or tactile, or the feeling of the muscle movement itself, which is called kinesthetic, that memory serves as the cue. And this leads to this fundamental concept called ideomotor action.
Ideomotor action. Okay, what's that?
The core idea is the mere mental idea of a movement's sensory outcome is actually sufficient to trigger that movement, unless there's some other competing idea or impulse actively blocking it.
Wow. So just thinking about doing it is enough to make it start, unless I consciously stop myself.
In simple cases, that's the basic principle, yes.
Yeah.
The idea flows directly into action. It's seen as the natural, immediate effect of having a feeling or an idea in consciousness.
Okay.
And this framework really sets the stage for understanding different kinds of decision-making, especially the more complex ones that involve effort.
Right, and this is where the idea of willpower comes in, the feeling of effort.
Precisely. While lots of simple actions might be fairly automatic ideomotor responses, many situations involve conflicting ideas, or maybe strong impulses pulling us away from a goal we've set.
Yeah.
The text really focuses on the type of decision that requires conscious effort, what it calls a fiat, to overcome that resistance. This typically happens when a less automatic, maybe more ideal or intellectual motive needs to win out over a stronger, more immediate impulse or habit.
And the amount of effort we feel seems tied to how hard it is to push past that resistance,
Yeah.
like pushing against a strong current.
Yes, exactly. The text suggests the magnitude of that conscious effort we feel is somehow proportional to the resistance being overcome. This deliberate, effortful struggle to keep an ideal thought or motive prominent in our consciousness, despite the pull of other things, is described as being central to ideal action or moral action.
Okay, fascinating. Shifting gears a bit now to how we actually think abstractly. We pride ourselves on being rational animals, right? But what is reasoning from this text perspective?
It defines reasoning, essentially, as the ability to substitute parts, or abstract properties, for whole concrete things. So instead of just dealing with this specific, loud, red fire engine rushing past, we can reason about abstract qualities, like vehicles in general, or loudness, or emergency response. We pull out characteristics.
And the text mentions a difference between being insightful, sagacious, and being knowledgeable or learned.
Yes, exactly. Sagacity is seeing the relevant abstract property in the concrete thing, like seeing vermilion paint not just as a color, but recognizing it as a mercury compound. Learning, then, is knowing all the implications and connections that come with that abstract property once you've identified it.
Okay. And what does the text mean by a mode of conceiving something?
It's basically about how we choose to focus.
Yeah.
Any object, any situation has countless attributes, right? But a mode of conceiving is consciously or unconsciously fixing on specific attributes while ignoring others.
And what guides which attributes we pick out?
Our interests, our needs, our purposes at that moment. What we care about dictates what we notice in abstract.
So what we care about literally shapes how we reason about the world.
Absolutely. The text argues that a creature with very limited interests will only pick out a few features and thus have pretty limited reasoning power. It suggests that man's incredibly varied instincts and interests are precisely what drives his superior ability to mentally pull apart complex phenomena and reason about their different components.
That makes sense. And is there a fundamental difference proposed between how humans reason and how animals might?
Well, the text speculates that the most elementary difference might be the human mind's much greater ability to associate ideas by similarity.
Similarity.
Yeah. Animals, it posits, might be less able to pick out a common property across many different experiences. For them, that property might remain kind of drowned in the total concrete situation. Humans, on the other hand, can see the similarity between vastly different things and abstract that common element, which is key for higher reasoning.
Interesting. Now, what about things like necessary truths? Things that seem absolutely certain just by thinking about them, like mathematical rules or logical principles. Where do those come from, according to the text?
Ah, yes, that's a deep philosophical puzzle, isn't it? The text discusses various views. Are they innate ideas we're born with? Are they somehow built up from the experiences of our ancestors, passed down through generations? That was Spencer's idea.
And what's the text leaning?
It argues that certain fundamental relations, things like difference, resemblance, equality, like the logical rule that equals of equals are equal, and also the way we classify things in series, these seem to be relationships that exist between our conceptions themselves.
Between the ideas.
Yes. They're knowable just by analyzing our own ideas, independently of the specific order in which we happen to encounter things in the external world.
So more like part of the mind's inherent structure.
Exactly. The text almost describes them as forming this beautiful, ideal sort of network that's already present in the mind. And it suggests we kind of hope to find that external reality fits into this internal logical framework.
And science is part of that hope.
Very much so. Science, in this view, is largely about the attempt to successfully apply these ideal frameworks, especially mathematical and mechanical ones, to understand and predict what happens in the world. This is contrasted with older approaches, maybe like seeking purely teleological, purpose-driven, or aesthetic explanations, which often don't yield the same kind of predictive power.
Okay, let's loop back to origins for a moment. We talked about the definition of instinct, but where do these complex instincts, and maybe even our fundamental ways of thinking, actually come from?
Right, going back to instinct, we mentioned Spencer's idea that they were essentially inherited habits, perfected over generations.
Mm,
But the text is actually quite skeptical about that. It points out that the evidence for this hereditary transmission of acquired characters, that the idea that things you learn can be passed down genetically, was pretty weak even then. How exactly would a parent's learned skill get physically wired into their child's brain? It's mechanism problem.
right. So what's the alternative explanation that's presented more favorably?
Darwin's view, basically. Natural selection. Instincts arise, in this view, from the selection of essentially random, accidental variations in behavior.
Random variations.
Yeah, certain instinctive behaviors just appear, maybe due to unknown variations in the nervous system. If those behaviors happen to be beneficial for survival and reproduction, the individuals who have them are more likely to pass them on. Over time, these beneficial variations get enhanced and refined. Habit might play a role in strengthening them within an individual's lifetime, but it's not the origin, according to this view.
So random change in selection, not directly inheriting learned stuff.
That's the core idea presented as more likely. And the text readily admits that the ultimate origin of elementary feelings themselves, why we feel this way in response to that stimulus, remains a deep mystery, a recondite history, as it puts it.
Okay. What about abstract discoveries then, like scientific breakthroughs or new mathematical concepts? Are those just built up piece by tiny piece from direct experience?
The text suggests, maybe not always, it proposes that they often arise more like sudden, lucky fancies or spontaneous variations that happen within the brain itself.
Like flashes of insight.
Exactly, almost like flashes of poetry or wit. These abstract ideas seem to sometimes just bubble up from the mind's internal activity, its own structural possibilities. The crucial difference, of course, for scientific or mathematical ideas is that they must then be rigorously verified against external reality or logical consistency. That internal hunch has to actually work when tested against the world.
That connects back to what you said about the ideal network, hoping to find its match in reality.
Precisely. Even something we take as fundamental, like believing in the uniformity of nature, the basic assumption that the laws of physics will keep working tomorrow, just like they did today. The text frames this less as a simple fact we learn directly from experience, and more like a kind of religious faith or a fundamental postulate, a working hypothesis that we actively bring to our experience. We seek to confirm it, sometimes even when appearances might seem chaotic or contradictory.
So it's like some knowledge comes directly from interacting with the world, learning associations, forming habits, but other core ideas, these abstract truths and logical frameworks, seem to spring more from the mind's own inherent organization and activity.
That's the dynamic, yeah. It's this constant interplay. The mind isn't just a passive slate being written on by the world. It has its own structure, its own ways of generating ideas and frameworks that it then tests against the world.
Okay, perfect. To bring this all full circle then, let's end on belief. We touched on it earlier, but how does the text really characterize what it means to believe something?
Right. Belief isn't just about having an idea passively sitting in your head. It's described as a particular manner of conceiving that idea. And crucially, it involves a specific feeling that gets attached to it.
A feeling.
Yes, this feeling is what gives an idea its weight, its sense of reality, its grip on us, and its influence over our potential actions. It makes the idea feel potent.
A feeling of realness, maybe?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And the text suggests that pretty much any idea or object that relates to our mind in some way, if there isn't a stronger contradictory relation present, can be felt as real.
Interesting.
And pain is highlighted again here as an especially powerful reality criterion. There's a very clear visceral difference, the text notes, between just dreaming you're in a fire and actually being in the fire. Pain tends to cut through doubt pretty effectively.
It grounds you instantly, yeah. And for more complex things like scientific theories or philosophies, belief isn't just intellectual agreement either.
No, not according to this view. Belief in complex conceptual systems is also driven by our deeper needs, our emotional requirements, our active tendencies. A philosophy, the text argues, won't gain widespread, deeply felt belief if its core principles fundamentally frustrate our deepest desires or our sense of emotional well-being. It has to resonate on more than just a logical level.
It has to feel right, not just think right.
Something like that, yes. And doubt, where does doubt fit in?
Good question.
Doubt in this view isn't actually a primary mental state. It arises specifically from the conflict between competing beliefs or ideas. You doubt one thing only because you simultaneously hold or are considering another belief that contradicts it. If you could somehow only ever entertain one single idea at a time, you wouldn't really experience doubt.
Wow. That's a profound thought. Doubt requires a clash, a competition.
Yeah.
And that leads into the idea about education helping with belief, right?
Yes, exactly. The text actually calls the ability to suspend belief, even when faced with an emotionally exciting or appealing idea, the highest result of education.
Why is that?
Because, it suggests, untutored minds often tend to automatically believe any thought that feels particularly vivid, exciting, or intensely real. For them, to feel something strongly is basically equivalent to believing it's true. The example given is the Caliph Omar supposedly burning the Library of Alexandria based on a simple, passionate conviction, illustrating that lack of critical distance, that inability to pause belief.
Right. It takes mental work, effort maybe, to stop and question something that feels compellingly true.
Exactly. Education, ideally, helps build that capacity for critical pause, for examining the grounds of belief rather than just being swept away by the feeling of it.
Okay. So when we put all these pieces together then, how we build reality from raw sensation, how vision actively interprets and sometimes creates illusions, how imagination can feel almost real, how actions can flow directly from ideas unless blocked, how instincts conflict within us, how we reason by abstracting, how necessary truths might be internal frameworks, and how belief itself is so tied to feeling.
Yeah.
It really paints this picture of the mind as this incredibly complex, dynamic, maybe sometimes contradictory system, doesn't it? Simple, raw feelings lead to complex actions. Abstract ideas are constantly battling with concrete impulses, and our whole sense of reality is this ongoing construction project.
It really underscores how much of what we experience day to day, what we believe, the decisions we make, is shaped by these underlying processes we've been digging into. The automatic interpretations, the sheer force of how something feels, the subtle pull of these conflicting, maybe hardwired impulses.
So as you, our listener, navigate your own day after hearing this, maybe notice these things, how much of what you perceive as just solid, objective reality might be your mind actively filling in the blanks or selecting certain inputs? How much of a gut feeling is maybe your body's reaction driving the emotion? How many decisions are really driven by something other than pure cold logic?
Yeah, it makes you think. And that prompts maybe a final provocative thought pulling from the text. If our sense of reality is constructed relative to us, if our emotions really are our bodily states as we perceive them, and if our most ideal or rational thoughts often require a conscious felt effort to win out over more immediate impulses, then how much of what you identify as yourself, the conscious agent making choices, how much of that you is actually a force shaping the world around you? And how much is it perhaps an outcome that's already been shaped by these intricate, often hidden processes happening within you?
Something to really chew on there. Well, that wraps up this deep dive into the inner workings of the mind, drawing on these classic insights.